On the 3rd of April, 1973, a 44-year-old engineer named Martin Cooper walked down 6th Avenue in Manhattan, somewhere between 53rd and 54th Streets, carrying a device no human being had ever carried before. It was 10 inches long. It weighed 2.5 pounds. It had been built by hand in roughly 90 days, and its battery could hold a conversation for 35 minutes before it died. Cooper stopped on the sidewalk, raised the prototype to his ear, and dialed a number he knew by heart. On the other end of the line was Joel Engel, the head of research at Bell Labs, the man running AT&T's competing program to build the same thing. "Joel, this is Marty," Cooper said. "I'm calling you from a cell phone, a real cell phone, a personal, handheld, portable cell phone." There was silence on the other end. To this day, Engel says he does not remember the call. But the device Cooper held, a prototype called the Dynatac, would define the next half-century of human communication. And the company that built it had started, 45 years earlier, with a broken battery business and a car radio in a Chicago garage. You are watching American Electronics and Tech Channel, where we take apart the companies that built the electronic world, down to the circuit board and the engineer who designed it. This one starts with a car radio and ends on the surface of the moon, with a few billion phones in between. If that is your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because what Motorola built and what it lost is stranger than most fiction. Paul Vincent Galvin was born in 1895 in Harvard, Illinois, a small town 60 miles northwest of Chicago. He was not an engineer by training. He attended the Illinois Institute of Technology, but made his living by trying, failing, and starting over. In 1921, Galvin and a friend named Edward Stewart opened a storage battery factory in Marshfield, Wisconsin. It failed within 2 years. In 1926, they tried again in Chicago, manufacturing a device called a battery eliminator, which allowed battery-powered radios to run on household electricity. That company failed too. But before it went under, Galvin learned something. He understood radio, he understood power, and he understood that the American consumer wanted to listen to something wherever they went. When the company collapsed, Galvin walked into the bankruptcy auction and bought back his own equipment for $750. Most men would have found another line of work. Galvin found another company. On September 25, 1928, Paul Galvin and his brother Joseph incorporated the Galvin Manufacturing Corporation at 847 West Harrison Street in Chicago. They had 5 employees and $565 in capital, scraped together from what was left after the auction. Their first product was the battery eliminator sold to Sears, Roebuck & Company. It kept the lights on, barely. But the stock market crash of 1929 was killing the home radio market, and Galvin knew the eliminator had no future. He needed a new product. He needed something that moved. 2 young men from Quincy, Illinois, were about to provide it. Elmer Wavering and William Lear had been tinkering with car radios since high school, when Wavering worked in a radio parts shop that Lear operated. The story most often repeated is that the idea came to them on a date with their girlfriends, who complained there was no music at the local lookout point. The documented record is thinner than the legend, and honesty requires a flag here, but what is certain is this. Wavering and Lear built a working car radio prototype, brought it to a radio convention in Chicago, and met Paul Galvin. He saw the future immediately. Galvin hired them, and they installed their radio in his Studebaker. In the spring of 1930, with no money for a booth at the Radio Manufacturers Association convention in Atlantic City, Galvin drove that Studebaker 800 miles, parked it at the entrance to the pier, and cranked the volume. His wife Lillian stood beside the car, helping demonstrate the radio to anyone who stopped to listen. The crowds came. On June 23, 1930, Galvin sold his first branded car radio to a man named Herbert C. Wall of Fort Wayne, Indiana, for $30. The retail model, the 5T71, sold for $110, and the brand name Galvin coined for it, a marriage of motor and Victrola, was Motorola. The name became more famous than the man who invented it. But the Depression was no friend to luxury goods, and selling car radios in a country that could barely afford bread was a grind that nearly broke the company more than once. Then, a war arrived, and Motorola discovered what it was truly built for. In 1940, the company began developing portable two-way radios for the United States military. The work was led, in part, by a man whose name almost nobody outside the engineering record knows. Henryk Magnuski was a Polish telecommunications engineer, born in Warsaw in 1909, educated at the Warsaw University of Technology. In June of 1939, his employer sent him to New York to study American radio transmitters. 3 months later, Germany invaded Poland. Magnuski could not go home. In 1940, he joined Galvin Manufacturing in Chicago and became the principal RF engineer on the SCR-300, a 35-pound backpack radio with a range of 20 miles that became the first device American soldiers called the walkie-talkie. Magnuski holds 3 patents on it. The Army built nearly 50,000 of them. They changed how infantry, artillery, and armor communicated across every front in Europe and the Pacific. The company was learning, contract by contract, how to make the human voice portable. That lesson would take decades to fully pay off, but every Motorola product that followed carried its echo. Peace brought expansion. In 1947, the company introduced one of the first televisions to sell for under $200 and officially changed its name from Galvin Manufacturing Corporation to Motorola Incorporated. Government contracts kept flowing through the Cold War. Motorola built pagers. It built the transistorized car radio, and then it built something that left the Earth entirely. On July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface of the moon and said the words that 600 million people heard, those words traveled from the lunar surface to 3 receiving stations on Earth through a Motorola S-band transponder. Motorola engineers in Scottsdale, Arizona, had designed the transponder, the backpack antenna Armstrong wore, and the equipment that processed the television signal for broadcast. The company that started with a car radio in a Studebaker had carried the human voice 250,000 miles through the vacuum of space. Paul Galvin did not live to see it. He died on November 5, 1959, at 64 years old, and his son Bob Galvin took the wheel. But the mission Paul built, making communication move, was about to enter its most radical chapter. Martin Cooper believed something that almost no one at AT&T or Bell Labs was willing to say out loud. A telephone should belong to a person, not to a car, not to a desk, not to a wall. AT&T wanted mobile phones locked inside vehicles. Cooper wanted them in pockets. He and his team at Motorola built the Dynatac prototype in roughly 90 days, and on that April sidewalk in 1973, he proved the concept with one phone call to his rival. But proving it and selling it were different problems. It took a full decade of regulatory battles and engineering refinement before the commercial version, the Dynatac 8000X, reached store shelves in 1983. It cost $3,995, which is roughly $12,000 adjusted for inflation. It weighed nearly 2 pounds. It offered 30 minutes of talk time. Wall Street traders carried them. The phone appeared in Gordon Gekko's hand in the film Wall Street. People called it the brick. It was a status symbol that doubled as an engineering miracle, and Motorola owned it completely. What followed was a 13-year run of dominance that produced 2 more machines worth remembering. The StarTAC, launched in 1996, was the first truly popular clamshell phone, inspired, its designers said, by the communicator from Star Trek. It weighed 3.5 ounces. It sold 60 million units. It could disappear into a shirt pocket, and the satisfying snap of its closure became one of the signature sounds of the late 90s. Then came the Razr 5 III, released in 2004, and nothing Motorola ever built sold like it. 13.9 millimeters thin, machined from aluminum, it was not merely a phone but a piece of industrial design that people displayed the way they displayed jewelry. It sold more than 130 million units worldwide, the best-selling clamshell phone in history. At its peak, Motorola employed 150,000 people, held roughly 22% of the global mobile phone market, and had defined what a phone looked like, felt like, and sounded like for 3 consecutive decades. But inside that triumph, a familiar American tragedy was already growing. Motorola kept selling Razrs and variants of Razrs and cheaper Razrs long after the design had peaked, because the margins were comfortable and the engineers who saw what was coming were not the ones making the decisions. The company that had invented the handheld phone was about to be blindsided by a different kind of handheld phone entirely. Before the smartphone even arrived, Motorola had already bled itself on a gamble that belonged in a different century. In the late 1980s, the company conceived Iridium, a global satellite telephone network requiring 66 low Earth orbit satellites. The vision was communication from any point on the planet. The cost was $5 billion. Iridium launched commercial service on November 1, 1998. By May of 1999, it had 10,000 subscribers. By August, it had defaulted on $1.5 billion in debt and filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Motorola's financial exposure was $2.2 billion. The entire satellite constellation was eventually sold for $25 million, roughly the price of a single satellite's launch. You can read the Iridium decision two ways: as brilliant engineering ahead of its market, or as institutional hubris that confused building something magnificent with building something anyone needed. Honest history holds both readings at once, but the wound was still fresh when, on January 9, 2007, Apple introduced the iPhone. Motorola's market share fell from 21% in 2006 to 2% by 2011. Between 2007 and 2009 alone, the company lost $4.3 billion. On January 4, 2011, the company that Paul and Joseph Galvin had founded in a rented Chicago office split into two separate entities: Motorola Solutions, which kept the government and public safety communications business, and Motorola Mobility, which kept the consumer phones. Motorola Mobility was immediately in trouble. In May of 2012, Google acquired it for $12.5 billion, the largest acquisition in Google's history. Driven almost entirely by Motorola's portfolio of 17,000 patents that could defend the Android operating system, Google did not want the phone business. It wanted the intellectual property. 19 months later, in January 2014, Google sold Motorola Mobility to China's Lenovo for $2.910 billion. Google kept the vast majority of the patents. Lenovo got the brand, the trademark, and 2,000 patent assets. A company that once employed 150,000 people and carried the first words from the moon had its consumer division bought for $12.5 billion, stripped of its patents, and resold for less than a quarter of the price. The mathematics of that transaction is its own kind of elegy. But Motorola, in both its halves, refused to disappear entirely. Motorola Solutions, headquartered back in Chicago, now commands a market capitalization north of $65 billion and annual revenue approaching $12 billion, powering the radios and communication networks used by police, firefighters, and paramedics across more than 100 countries. The mission Paul Galvin started, making the voice move in a crisis, still runs through the company's core. Motorola Mobility, under Lenovo, revived the Razr name as a foldable smartphone in 2019, and by 2025 it was the top-selling foldable in North America. Collectors still trade original Dynatac 8000X units and StarTacs online, and working models fetch prices that would have baffled their original owners. The engineers who built these devices, from Henryk Magnuski soldering walkie-talkie circuits in wartime Chicago to Martin Cooper assembling a prototype on a deadline measured in days, made things that outlasted the corporations that sold them. That is the verdict of the people who used them, and it is the only verdict that history respects. On a Manhattan sidewalk in 1973, Martin Cooper held a 2.5-pound prototype to his ear and called a man who did not remember the conversation. The device was crude and heavy, and it could barely last through a short phone call. But every mobile phone on Earth descends from that moment, from that sidewalk, from that company. Motorola invented the phone call of the future, and then could not survive the phone that replaced it. The engineers built it, the executives sold it, the market moved on. And the signal, if you listen carefully, is still traveling. If you ever owned a Motorola, if you carried a Razr in your pocket, or a StarTac on your belt, or watched your parents talk into a Dynatac that weighed as much as a small dog, drop a comment below. Tell us the model, the year, and whether it still works. The people who use these phones know more about what was lost than the people who sold the company. Subscribe if you want to keep building this archive with us. We have the story of another American tech empire coming next, and you will not want to miss how it ends.